Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anshula Mehta, Assistant Director at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi. And on behalf of the Gender Impact Studies Center at IMPRI, I welcome you all to this web policy talk, a distinguished lecture by Mr. Mohammad Naciri on the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls in Asia and the Pacific. With that, I invite Dr. Simi Mehta, our moderator for today, to take it forward. Thank you.
Good evening and a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you, Anshula, for leading us into the discussion. To delve into the very important topic of impact of COVID-19 on women and girls in Asia and the Pacific, we have with us Mr. Mohammad Naciri to deliver this distinguished lecture. The session is being chaired by Professor Govind Kelkar, and we are joined by Professor M. Niaz Asadullah, Ms. Nandita Baruah, and Ms. Irfa as discussants. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Govind Kelkar, who is the Executive Director of the GenDev Center for Research and Innovation at Gurugram in India, and Chairperson of the Gender Impact Studies Center at Impact and Policy Research Institute. Professor Kelkar has worked extensively on gender relations in rural Asia, and she has contributed numerous articles to scholarly journals and written over 16 books with a focus on political economy of land rights, gender and energy in Asia, and has been in close touch with women's movements in the region. Professor Kelkar holds a PhD in political economy of China and is a visiting professor at the Council for Social Development in New Delhi. Concurrently, she is also a regional council member of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development in Thailand, adjunct distinguished professor of Asian Institute of Technology, Thailand, honorary professor at the Yunnan Academy of Social Sciences at Yunnan, China, member of the steering committee of the BRICS Feminist Watch, and visiting fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Earlier, she was also a senior advisor at Landesa, Seattle, USA, and was also senior advisor at UN Women, South Asia Office, New Delhi. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us and accepting our invitation to chair the session. With your permission, I would like to introduce to all of you, Mr. Mohammad Naciri. Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Mohammad Naciri is the Regional Director of UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok, Thailand. Prior to this, he was the Regional Director and the Deputy Regional Director of UN Women in the Arab states. Mr. Mohammad has extensive experience in working with gender and development issues. Prior to joining UN Women, he was the Deputy Country Director of UNDP in Yemen, where he supported the country in the formulation of its gender strategy and gender responsive budgeting process. He has worked in Kuwait, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Cambodia, dealing with issues from human trafficking to ethnic cleansing. He is a national of Morocco, and he holds a master's degree in public administration and international development from the Harvard University, as well as a master's degree in social anthropology from the University of Oxford. He also has a master's degree in business administration from the Arab Academy of Science and Technology in Alexandria, Egypt. Thank you, sir, for joining us this evening. And I invite Professor Kelkar for her opening remarks and invite Mr. Naciri thereafter. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Simi. I think you have really done the task. So we have a kind of tremendous pleasure having a kind of very eminent panel of Professor or Mr. First Mohammad Naciri, who I have heard of, and sir, it is a great pleasure to listen to you today. And I also think that we are really representing Asia today. In South Asia, some time ago, there was a trend that talking of India and maybe a little bit of China, and then that was considered Asia. But now we have really representation of many Asian countries. For example, besides yourself, sir, from West Asia or Arab region, Professor Niaz Asadullah is from the University of Malaya, Kuala Lumpur. So Malaysia is represented. Ms. Nandita Baruah, country representative of Asia Foundation. She's from India, and I hope she represents, of course, Asia Foundation. She's the country representative of Asia Foundation. And Irfa Puspitasari. She is from the University of Indonesia. It's a mix of Hindi and Indonesian word, and that's why I was getting stuck in not making a Hindiized or Indianized version. It is pleasure to be in this great kind of learning session this afternoon or evening on diverse views with attention to the continued impact of COVID-19 on women and girls in Asia and Pacific region. This is a very unique opportunity to having representatives from various parts of Asia, particularly from West, Southeast, and South Asia. In India, we have seen the three major impact, and probably my colleagues would bear me out later in the discussion. As far as I have seen these three major impact on women and girls, one has been really the gender differential effects on women's employment, and including self-employment, loss of economic jobs, and the pauperization and increase in inequality and increase in pauperization. Second is about increased unpaid care work. The families returned home, the schooling of the children were at home. But what is amazing is that kind of thing. All this was also accompanied by the third feature in terms of the gender differential effect, and that was the surge in domestic violence during this COVID period. And that's why I call it a continued impact, because we have not yet seen really either the post-pandemic situation or the relief in any of these measures, although there seems to be rebound of the economy, but still we have not really seen in terms of women's treatment or any kind of good measures taken for the on the gender issues or gender relations. So with these kind of words, I welcome you, sir, Mr. Mohammad Naciri, to address us and say something about the region. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. A very good afternoon to our friends in India and a very good evening for the rest of us in Southeast Asia. I am very grateful actually to be with IMPRI tonight. I'm by no means an expert, maybe a practitioner, and I'm here to equally exchange reflections and notes and come out of this session also learning from your good selves. You've said it all, Professor Kelkar, and I'm really humbled to be with you. My plea on the way forward, just to call me Mohammad without a Mr. It's much easier.
Okay, and please call me Govind.
As you've said it, Professor Kelkar, COVID has really unleashed an unprecedented crisis, taking a toll on all countries across Asia and the Pacific region and the globe. It not only threatens to reverse decades of progress towards fully realizing the 17 sustainable goals, but it also exacerbates fragilities and inequalities within and among nations. The impacts and implications of COVID are different from for men and women. Women and girls are among those bearing the heaviest brunt of the pandemic devastating effects. In our region, as we know, women have been hit harder by the economic impacts of COVID, as you rightly said, with more women losing their jobs and income opportunities. The biggest reason for these losses is that the industries hardest hit by the pandemic, leisure, hospitality, education, are disproportionately female. Working from home also puts women at a disadvantage, giving challenges such as broadband access, the availability or the lack of home office space, and childcare and homeschooling duties. The digital divide has resulted in fewer women receiving necessary information to prepare for COVID. In Bangladesh and Pakistan, for example, women are less likely to receive information about potentially life-saving information. The significant increase in unpaid care and domestic work for women may be a major contributing factor to the pandemic disproportionately affecting women's mental health and emotional health. Our evidence showed that women were feeling unprepared for the additional role of homeschooling, which has potential to increase tension and stress within the household. Obviously, this has implications for the balance between men and women's roles inside the household. In the Philippines, Bangladesh, for example, women are more likely to experience increases in unpaid domestic and unpaid care work since the spread of COVID. For instance, in Bangladesh, 55% of women reported increases in unpaid domestic work compared to 44% of men. Our research also confirms the severe impacts on small and medium enterprise and the particular vulnerability of women-owned enterprises. In Women's recent survey of female entrepreneurs in Asia, 90% said their business was negatively or very negatively impacted by COVID. The increased care burden also has significantly impacted small women-owned businesses, with 50% of the respondents to the survey reporting that they were spending less time on their business activities because their caregiving responsibilities had increased. This is on top of evidence showing that in Asia the Pacific region, women were already spending 4 times as much time as men on unpaid care work prior to the crisis. And in some countries, it goes up to 11 times more than men. Since the spread of COVID, 30% of women and 20% of men also experienced increases in the intensity of unpaid domestic work as measured by performing at least 3 domestic or care work activities. Single women identified as unmarried, widowed, divorced females living in households with children have noted the greatest increases. The significant increase in unpaid care and domestic work for women may be a major contributing factor to the pandemic disproportionately affecting women's mental and emotional health. It also quickly became apparent that COVID unleashed not only 1, but 2 pandemics, as domestic violence against women and girls surged under the lockdown. COVID increased intimate partner violence, as evidenced by the skyrocketing rise in calls to domestic violence helplines across the region. Domestic violence and its implications we can no longer ignore. COVID, much like most other crises, has increased the risk of violence against women and girls, disruptions of support services for victims living under mobility restrictions increased, unemployment rates and economic insecurity resulting from the pandemic all create heightened risks, especially if victims are confined at home with their abusers. UN Women's latest report highlighted how violence against women and girls has increased, which is manifested online as search queries related to violence against women and girls, including physical, sexual, and psychological violence, all rose. For example, searches related to physical violence, which include keywords such as physical abuse signs, violent relationships, and cover bruises on face in Malaysia, Philippines, and Nepal grew by 47%, 63%, and 55% respectively. In some countries, resources and efforts have been diverted from violence against women response to immediate COVID relief. In addition to that, there is also the economic dimension, as we earlier mentioned. Women disproportionately work in insecure labor. Women in the informal sectors with precarious work conditions continue to have no access to social safety nets. Disruptions, including movement restrictions, can remove women's ability to make a living and meet their families' basic needs. Due to societal gender-assigned roles, women and girls are likely to be spending more time caring for and providing educational support to children. Older people are at greater risk of falling ill if infected by COVID, and in Asia, where elderly often live with their children, women shoulder the responsibility of caring for them. Globally, 70% of the poorly paid healthcare workers are women in frontlines response, often without training or proper safety equipment. As we have already seen, disasters affect women, girls, boys, and men in all their diversity differently. From life expectancy to education, health, safety, job security, and nutrition, women are disproportionately impacted by disasters, including climate-related disasters and pandemics. Women's exposure and vulnerability are amplified by the presence of underlying risk drivers, including gender inequality, and by their lack of agency and leadership in disaster resilience efforts. Asia and the Pacific continues to be the region most prone to disaster impacts in the world. Between 1970 and 2018, the region had 87% of the people affected by natural hazards globally. 3 out of 4 people affected by a natural disaster live in the region. More than 760 million people in the past 5 years, with nearly 46,000 deaths. As a result, over 6.9 million people have been displaced, and nearly half, 48%, are women and girls. COVID serves as a compounding threat to the Asia-Pacific region, which continues to be hit by a relentless sequence of disasters, ranging from cyclones and earthquakes to tsunamis, floods, and droughts. While disasters linked to environmental degradation and climate change are increasing in their complexity, intensity, and uncertainty. While mega disasters could hit highly urbanized cities, these large-scale events could take a heavy toll on countries with lower coping capacities, such as Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, or Papua New Guinea. The intersection of COVID with climate-induced disasters is driving cascading risks and reshaping the riskscape in the region, making its population more prone to extreme poverty, marginalization, and disempowerment across generations. Against this backdrop, gender inequality heightens exposure to risks, increased vulnerability, and restrains capacity. It renders women and girls uneven capacity to anticipate, adapt, and recover from disasters, and to contribute effectively to resilience building. There are differentiated impacts on different women target groups, and when we speak about women migrant workers, they are already more likely to work in insecure labor under precarious conditions. Women in South Asia are also less likely than men to be covered by health insurance. The collapse of global supply chains has meant that many women workers, including women migrant workers and those in micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, have lost their livelihoods almost overnight, without any safety nets, financial security, or social protection to rely on. Tens of thousands of women migrant workers, often working in informal employment, have been forced to return to their home countries and are facing stigma and discrimination in addition to loss of income. For example, Myanmar, before the events, had the highest share, 33% of intra-Asian migrants, with estimates indicating only about 8% of the 4 million migrant workers have legal status that gives them social protection and decent working conditions. Only 8%. Given that women migrant workers are more frequently undocumented, they will be disproportionately impacted by the inability to access social protection services during COVID. The crisis has aggravated women migrant workers' increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence at all stages of migration. Women workers, including women migrant workers, of which there are 34 million in Asia and the Pacific, play a crucial role in services and labor-intensive manufacturing, as well as in small and medium enterprises and in the informal sector, on which much of the formal sector depends. These economic activities are now on hold and under threat because of lockdowns, border closures, broken supply chains, and discontinuation of production. When it comes to women healthcare workers, they constitute 70% of the workers in the health and social sector globally and are on the front lines of the response. Women being a greater proportion of frontline workers are therefore disproportionately at risk of indirect impact resulting from publishing schedules and burnout, as well as direct risks of the virus. Within the sector, an average gender pay gap is 28%, which may be exacerbated in times of crisis. On top of this, the increases in unpaid care and domestic work for women also limits their ability to provide healthcare services, decreasing the health sector capacity to effectively respond and to prevent further spread of COVID. Women healthcare workers have called attention to their specific needs beyond personal protective equipment, including to meet menstrual hygiene needs. Psychological support should also be provided to frontline responders. This needs to be the group prioritized for vaccine distribution, which is not the case in every country. What can be done to mitigate gender impacts of the pandemic? In the short term, we must start by prioritizing saving lives of all, including caregivers from health risk of COVID, by investing in information, training, safety equipment, fair wages, and just and favorable conditions of work. Inclusive communication. Ensure information, messaging, and community outreach on COVID is inclusive and accessible and does not reinforce harmful gender stereotypes. Prioritize girls' education. Ensure school closures where they exist do not further disadvantage girls or at-risk populations such as children with disabilities, ethnic minorities, and those from rural communities. We must take special care of vulnerable populations, prioritize services for protection for sex workers, people with disabilities, and LGBTQI++ people, and continue response measures to counter human trafficking. It is important to focus on migration and supporting migrants, ensuring that the broader border quarantine facilities are established and maintained according to the best practice gender-sensitive control measures. The private sector also is a partner in the solution. They should, as much as possible, allow for flexible working hours, paid leave, and work from home facilities as far as possible, taking into account the care responsibilities that many women bear. They should also ensure that workers, including caregivers, are provided with adequate equipment to protect themselves when at work. In the medium and the longer term, we must focus on higher female labor force participation, with steps to address unpaid care work as a critical priority to boost economic growth. Frameworks to recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid and underpaid care work should be developed, and public investment in care infrastructure alongside investment in public service infrastructure should be enhanced. There is an opportunity to professionalize and create 100 million secure and decent work opportunities in the care economy. This can be accomplished by creating women's social enterprise in care work and supporting the transition of care workers from informal to the formal economy through training, education, and certification. To free more women up to work for pay requires, for instance, expanding affordable childcare, improving household and transport infrastructure, deploying digital technologies, and sharing unpaid work more equally between men and women through, for instance, policies promoting parental leave and flexible working. Capture the economic and social benefits of improving access to digital technologies. Access to technology can open many economic doors to women. The rise of e-commerce and the online gig economy offers many women flexibility in terms of their working hours and where they work, helping them to balance work with their family commitments. There is widespread evidence that digital technologies connect women with larger markets far more effectively than if they are offline. Digital banking levels and the playing field between men and women in terms of access to financial services. And it enables financial institutions to serve more customers profitably. However, the digital gender divide in the Asia Pacific has been growing. Between 2013 and 2019, the internet usage gap between men and women rose from 17.4% to 24.4%. It is crucial to engage women as leaders, ensure diverse women are given opportunities to meaningfully engage in structures and processes established for COVID prevention, mitigation, and response. We need countries to invest in universal gender-responsive social protection, including effective and affordable access to quality healthcare, immediate income, and food support. We must also ensure that urgent and flexible funding to women's rights organizations, health and support services, and helplines are available in order to address the growing shadow pandemic of violence against women and girls. These are some reflections, and I'm apologetic for rambling for too long, but allow me to give the floor back to you, Professor Kelkar, and I will be more than humbled to listen to my esteemed panelists and engage in a fruitful discussion. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Naciri. It was wonderful listening to you, and so many facts that you have provided. Amazing. I mean, there are a lot of parallels that we can draw even in this region, India in particular. So, Professor Kelkar, if you could start with the discussion and we could go to our panelists. Professor Kelkar? Yes.
I think our usual way has been that we listen to the discussant first, and then probably I would try to sum up and in terms of major points raised for the questions and answers. Is that okay to,
yes,
to the distinguished panelist? Is that okay?
Okay, ma'am. So, ma'am, may I introduce our discussants?
Please do.
Yes, yes. So the first discussant for the evening is Professor M. Niaz Asadullah, who is professor, faculty of economics and administration at the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur. He holds a PhD in economics from Oxford University in 2005. And previously, he has taught economics at Reading University, United Kingdom, and has held various positions at Harvard, Oxford, Manchester, Kent, Dhaka University, and other universities. His research relates to poverty, inequality, well-being, education, labor market, gender issues, with a focus on South and Southeast Asia and also Islamic countries. And his work has been supported by a number of agencies like Social Security Research Center, Australian Development Research Award, South Asian Network of Economic Research Institutes, World Bank, UNESCAP, World Health Organization, and many, many more. And he has published extensively in reputed journals and media articles. And he's also the co-editor of the Handbook of Labor, Human Resources, and Population Economics from Springer Nature. And he's also on the editorial board of several journals. Thank you, sir, for joining us this evening. And I would now invite you to reflect upon Mr. Mohammad's lecture. Over to you.
Sir, you are
You're
Okay, are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me in this very important forum. I'm really honored to be able to discuss this wonderful and very informative presentation by Mohammed, giving us a broad overview of how women are doing in Asia during the pandemic, and what can be done to sort of, improve their lives and address some of their critical outstanding reforms by taking advantage of the pandemic as an opportunity. So what I would do is to first quickly summarize, picking up on a couple of points that stood out for me from Mohammed's presentation, and then with reference to that, I will add a few more points, and hopefully I'll be able to provide some complementary insights based on my research in Malaysia as well as Bangladesh. So I happen to work on both parts of Southeast Asia. So hopefully this will be useful for families. So as I was listening, for me, there were 4 pillars of the presentation. The first is, taking stock of women's well-being, that the dimensions where the pandemic has hit them hard, the nature of their deprivation, or the new experience of poverty, if you like to call it. And then the second aspect is the lack of protection at home or at work or from the government. And the third aspect is, what really can be done to improve the current situation. And there has also been a reference to the heterogeneous effect of the crisis, that there are certain groups of women who apparently have suffered more than others, and why so. So, to quickly, summarize again the key points, for me, what stood out from the presentation is this, sharp increase in informal care as households throughout Asia tried to cope with the crisis. And given that a majority of, in many Asian countries are already in poverty, they are unable to comply with what the WHO has given as a guideline for providing protection in home setting. So the responsibility has therefore shifted to women, that women, female members were required to step in and provide care for other household members. In patriarchal setting, this means taking care of male members. And this has happened also at a time when the state has also shifted the burden of taking care of children in school to parents at home. And that again has put mothers in an awkward position, that they have been required to cover for what teachers would do in school in safe environment, take care of psychosocial and cognitive development of children. A lot of that expectation has shifted to mothers during the pandemic. And this has been varied within South Asia, which I will comment on later. But what it means is that women have been caught off guard, female members. They have not been prepared. Home environment in rural Asia have not been equipped with facilities and provisions. Parents, many of them are first generation learners. They're also deprived of capability to assist children at home, and therefore the disruption to the support system for children's development has put the pressure on women, and suddenly increasing already what we know, the double burden of work at home and outside for many Asian women. And what comes out from Mohammed's presentation is that this is happening without any recognition, be it at home or be it at work. So Mohammed points out that, well, there has been this sharp rise in unpaid care. And also he points out that even women working as frontline workers, there is a large pay gap. So what is clear is that be it at home or be it at work, there is this rise in demand for care. Women are taking care of others in the society, be it at home and outside, but as frontline workers, but without due recognition. And the other point that comes out from the presentation is it is not just the lack of recognition. Women are also on the receiving end, that they are experiencing more violence. So if I want to borrow the phrase from economics, it is a lot of stick without any carrot. Okay, so that's in a nutshell to summarize what's happening to women. And again, at workplace, Mohammad points out that because of the collapse of global supply chain, working women also have suffered in terms of loss of livelihood. And this is critical because he points out later on that the reason why women are vulnerable during crisis, not just in pandemic, but in other crises, is the lack of agency. And being able to work is a critical source of agency for women. And what the pandemic has done is to deplete that and even leaving women more vulnerable in times of crisis. So the point, therefore, is that, well, what can be done to protect women and to prepare them better as the economy reopens? Mohammad covers a range of options, better provision for childcare services, prioritizing girls' education, prioritizing service for sex workers and other vulnerable female groups, and most importantly, addressing a long due reform, which is recognizing women's work and giving them their fair share, be it at home or be it in the labor market. And in this context, he also points out that it is about time to also leverage one big shift that has happened throughout Asia, which is the rise of online economy. And again, there is the worry of digital divide, that online economy is leaving behind women, and this is something that policymakers should look into. So that is, for me, some of the main highlights. Now let me add a few points to complement what has been said. Now, the first point that I want to make is that based on my research, it has not been a homogeneous story for girls and women throughout Asia. And it is because before the pandemic, Asian countries have been at different stages of development, particularly women's development. And that kind of shows in the way the pandemic is affecting women. Take the case of South Asia and Southeast Asia, where I am. So I have, my research on Bangladesh shows that, well, just like India, that there has been a worsening of gender inequality, particularly in education. When schools remain closed, there is evidence that girls have to do more household chores compared to boys, and also they're studying less at home compared to boys. Whereas come to Malaysia, it is the opposite. So boys are studying less compared to girls at home. And the big question is why? So this is where I want to bring in a bit of academic perspective, which is the difference, regional difference in baseline empowerment and baseline distribution of human capabilities by gender. So in Southeast Asia, for various reasons, partly because of government proactive policies and cultural reasons, gender disparity has been rather in the opposite direction, if you like. In most indicators in human development in particular, there has been gender parity. That is not the story of South Asia. So therefore, during times of crisis, women have less human capital and capability to protect themselves compared to women and girls in Southeast Asia. And that kind of shows up in the evidence. And this is something that policymakers, particularly Mohammad and his colleagues, should reflect on, that will showcasing the power of progressive, pro-women public policy, and how that has created this uneven pattern in terms of the cost and consequences of benefit throughout Asia. This can be a huge motivating point for activists and scholars and policymakers to shore up support for across the board reform to protect the well-being of women and girls in South Asia, so that in the context of another crisis, another pandemic, they are all protected. And there is an economic reasoning behind this. If women are protected, they are the ultimate frontline worker and they are the main caregiver at home. So this is also in the household interest to invest in women. And it is also in the interest of the state to invest in women. And I think this is, for me, therefore, an important takeaway based on Mohammad's presentation, that this pandemic, if anything, gives us one big reason to invest more vigorously on women and children in South Asia, and take inspiration from regions where this has been done and where those investments have gone to some extent to protect women themselves, as well as creating spillover effect for others in the society. So I think, the other point I want to make is something specific to India. Now, what has happened during the pandemic is that a lot of critical social services, public services have been stopped. And the primary beneficiaries of those were women. So what has happened, therefore, in South Asian context is that even before the pandemic, women had lower baseline empowerment and capabilities. So they critically dependent on public goods and state support. And that also have been taken away. And add to this that Mohammed pointed to disruption to global supply chain and the impact on women's livelihood. I want to bring up something related in case of India, which is a disruption to contraception. So contraceptives, because of the pandemic, supply have been affected, and that had huge implication for women's, reproductive and sexual health. We still don't have the evidence of how bad that has impacted women's reproductive and sexual health, but that is an area where I was hoping some information from UN Women's Research, and I would be keen to hear from Mohammed whether he has any such information, because for me that is an area of concern. Now, compared to South Asia, in Southeast Asia, we are blessed with a strong state. So what it means is that during times of crisis, state has better capability to provide and protect citizens in terms of continuing critical social services. In case of South Asia, again, based on my research, this is an across the region problem. There is a state capacity deficit. And that means that households, particularly women, are much more vulnerable. So therefore, the second takeaway for me is that alongside investment in women, the other thing this pandemic highlights, if I may compare with Southeast Asia, is this need to invest in critical state capacity. So I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to join in later. Thank you so much again for giving me this opportunity to participate. Thank you.
Simi, would you like to continue with the? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Niaz, for your wonderful reflections. I now invite Ms. Nandita Baruah. And to introduce Ms. Nandita, she is the Asia Foundation's country representative in India and formerly served as deputy country representative in Nepal. She has over 25 years of professional experience working on gender, human rights, labor migration, and human trafficking issues in South and Southeast Asia. She has also worked as the gender advisor to the CIDA in India and also as the South Asia Regional Gender Fund Manager. She was the regional coordinator for the UN Women Anti-Trafficking Program and the UNODC UN Gift Program. She has served as the USAID India as the regional anti-trafficking and gender specialist. In these roles, she has worked to support the national governments and also the civil society partners to design and deliver programs that effectively address the core socioeconomic and political dimensions of development through a right-based and gender equitable framework. Ms. Baruah has worked in India, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Nepal, and she holds a master's degree in historical studies and a master's degree in political economy from Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us this evening. I now invite you to share your comments.
Thank you, Simi, and thank you, Dr. Kelkar. It's really a pleasure to be with this esteemed panel. I think a very, very insightful presentation by Mohammad Naciri. So congratulations, Mohammad, for that wonderful presentation and bringing to light so many critical issues. I think I will take off from some of the things that Mohammad mentioned, and I want to break this down. I think one thing we need to keep in mind that the pandemic across the world happened in a pre-existing patriarchal setting. Given that there were already so many challenges which are gender differentiated across the world, I don't think it was really surprising that the impact of the pandemic itself was gendered in many ways. This was a health pandemic. We have lived through other natural disasters, be it the earthquake in Nepal in 2015 or the tsunami, or prior to that, other major earthquakes and natural catastrophes. And in each of that, we have seen that the way it impacts both the fallout of the disaster itself and the road to recovery are always very much differentiated along gender lines, but they are also differentiated along class, ethnicity lines. And I think we shouldn't forget that, because even the gender impact is not linear. It's not unidimensional, it affects women differently. And I'll come to that in a minute. I think what Mohammad made a point was on the social aspects are very critical. This pandemic brought home to us, because interestingly, when you do have disaster, the fallout is also different. Not everybody who lives through the disaster faces the natural disaster in the same way. I lived through the Nepal earthquake, and I can tell you that though it was a most horrific and traumatic experience, but my experience would nowhere be similar to what some of the people who lived in the interiors of Nepal may have faced, both men and women. So it would be unfair to say that I had the same experiential setting of the earthquake. The trauma and the mental health impact may have been somewhat similar, but the overall attempt at recovery and the social and access impact are definitely different, even from a gender point of view. However, having said that, I think in this case, the pandemic struck us all globally. It did not differentiate on caste, class, access in some ways. In certain ways, it did. It differentiated on your ability to buy more masks to go out and your inability to access them and therefore not go out or expose yourself to catching the disease in the early stages. Most of the issues these are certain things which also concerns me, as we say, especially when this is a pandemic which is so closely related to health. Let's just talk about health issues. How did it impact women's health? We heard Niaz talk about, of course, the access to reproductive health and how that may have been impacted. Still needs to be studied, because a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, contraceptive itself is probably is a taboo issue. Forget about access. In Southeast Asia, it may not have been taboo in some countries, taboo in others, but access was a problem. I think that was true across. However, besides that, it's also access to basic health. I was in another panel with a very esteemed medical professional of India from one of the top institutes who said that, even on regular times, the number of men who come to this medical institute for treatment is way higher than the number of women. So men, when they are ill, this family spends money to get them to a medical facility to ensure that they get treated. Now, during the pandemic, the challenge was much higher for women. Even for basic regular treatment, the number of women who came were much lower. So whether you are a diabetic patient or a patient who needs dialysis, a patient who needs blood transfusion or just other basic care, your overall health was deeply impacted, just from a gender point of view, in accessing those, doubly compounded by the pandemic itself. Add to that gender-based violence, and add to that the angle which both Mohammad and Niaz, you talked about the mental health. We know how poor mental health services are in our parts of the world, and the inability to access that support when you most needed it. One, from the gender-based violence perspective, yes, but from the impact of the pandemic itself and what it did to people's mental health, I think the outcomes were catastrophic. We are seeing more and more trends of, tendencies among younger people, of depression, of anxiety. In India, we saw in the midst of the pandemic, quite a few celebrities take their own lives, which happened. And this was also both men and women. But I think the isolation that it caused was extremely problematic. For women, it was doubly compounded by gender-based violence, as it has been pointed out by Mohammad. And I think these would have long-standing impact in our road to recovery. On the economic and on the community and the family side, I think it's also, the loss of livelihood impacted both communities and families deeply. We had the migrant crisis in India and it got talked about, but I want to talk about the migrant crisis that's looming in countries which are hugely dependent on migrant workers for their remittance, whether it's Philippines or it is Nepal, and the fact that many of these people had to return back to their country, many of the women had to return back because of the pandemic. And then you had additional challenges. So for example, in Nepal, a recent attempt to get this law where women below 40 could not get out of Nepal, could not fly out without the permission of their family or the ward member, further stopped or put a block on the possibility of recovery for women and in attempting to try and get back on their feet and recover their economic livelihood. In the middle of all the other challenges, these kind of policies and laws are probably the last thing you want to see. And a lot of this has been done in the name of protectionism. So I think one needs to start looking more carefully and advocating more on how those can be addressed. Women in India, for example, there was a massive surge in women in the gig economy in India prior to the pandemic, and the gig became a major source of livelihood option for women. It was booming. There was a 40% increase in intake. But when the pandemic hit us, the sectors that the women were employed in were the first to be hit because it required closer contract. They were either in the beauty cultures area or in the spa or in the gym and training kind of service delivery. So clearly the pandemic did not allow those kind of services to be made available and accessible, and they lost out on that economic journey that they had undertaken. Men, on the other hand, it's not that they didn't lose out, but they were also in sectors which I think after a point opened up as essential services, your carpentry, your plumbing. But at the same time, many of the men, because they had greater mobility or access to resources, were able to adapt to other gig platforms. So food service delivery, if you had a motorcycle and you were with, say, a company where you were doing carpentry, but that stopped, you immediately could transfer using your resources in hand and join up with a food service delivery company, which was operating throughout the process as an essential item of delivery. It was interesting how gig platforms like Amazon and Uber joined up with companies like Urban Clap or Urban Company, which were more service delivery, to look at these new areas. And there was some transference of quite a few employability options for men. Women, unfortunately, lost out on that race as well. Majority of the women, if there's one scooter, we know who's going to get it in the family. If there's a single scooty, if there's one smartphone and it needs to go to somebody, we know, given our systems, who in that family would get it. So a combination of social and cultural norms and the pandemic and the kind of challenges it's through definitely had a much larger negative impact on lives of women, both from a social economic perspective, definitely from a health perspective. And I also think it's important that as we are now coming to look at, and as Mohammad, you rightly pointed out, how do we get back this momentum? How do we get back to even to the pre-pandemic, forget about anything better, stage where there were some opportunities which were opening up for women, be it in enterprise or be it in the gig sector. I see an absence of affirmative action in these sectors from across the globe. I have looked at stimulus packages and I've tried to see, are they gender informed? We have massive mega stimulus packages, and it's not enough to be just gender neutral in them, because we know there is a gendered economic impact. You have to be gender affirmative, So there is a lot of study looking at, are the stimulus packages green? And I'm saying, wait a minute, they may be green, are they gendered? Where do we go with the stimulus package, which is not going to provide that additional support that women need to come back to just the pre-pandemic positions that they were in. Forget about, higher and upper. And I think opportunities are opening up, and rightfully said again, Mohammad, like there is this whole opportunity on the digital sphere. We went virtual, we realized we can work virtually. We work from our homes, everything, larger institutions like consulting firms of the top-notch ones are continuing to work from home and garnering more and more business. However, the digital divide needs to be kept in mind. Is this going, do we have enough women who have the skill to take full advantage of a digitally driven economic opportunities and livelihood, both in terms of skills and capacity, but also in terms of the resources that is necessary to work on a virtual or a digital platform, whether it's a laptop, a smartphone, an entire paraphernalia of gadgets that you might need at home, both for the mid and low income, but also for the blue collar worker. Interestingly, I think schools went digital, and we've heard both the speakers talk about how schools went digital, who suffered, but it's also interesting, schools went digital, so they wanted people to do digital curriculum and digital teaching. Multiple instances where schools promptly opted for male educationists who had greater access to and knowledge of digital skills, because most of the teachers in our part of the world are used to teaching in class. Even though we talk about us moving very fast in the digital arena, I think majority of our schools don't, at least in South Asia, don't necessarily have that high level of digital access and skills and capacities that are needed, which were definitely needed in this situation. And what we found is many female teachers ended up losing their jobs to men who knew how to just run digital classes because they could do that more easily, which was unfortunate. Also, it was not like they didn't have a job to go back to, but it was that during the time of the pandemic, there wasn't any income because these were outsourced to other agencies who brought in that digital ability to fulfill the need of the school curriculum. And I think these things have not really been studied. It's just that we are coping. I think we are all trying to cope with the pandemic, cope with the lack of access. And in that attempt to cope, the ability or the effort to deep dive into what are these coping mechanisms leading to within the societal divide has somehow been lost. And I think we need to look at that more critically. Access to vaccine is becoming a big issue. It's interesting that I don't know how much research is there, and maybe others can enlighten me, that it's interesting if everybody's saying more men get affected by COVID than women. Would be interesting to understand why. Is it because men continue to have access outside and go out while the pandemic was growing, or is it because men have poor immunity? I'm not sure which of the two it is, but it will be good to understand. If that is also true, does it mean therefore that using that as the basis, are women going to be denied the first access to the vaccine, and are more men going to get it? India has made many vaccines available to many countries, and I was just talking to somebody the other day, in having given so many vaccines as grant in aid, which is a great thing, did we give it with a gender lens and say, hey, here is a grant in aid from a country which would like you also to say that at least 50% of these vaccines should be given to women because this is a grant in aid? I don't think we made any such stipulation. It was given out, and I've heard back from countries where grant in aid vaccines have been sold in the open market. It's unfortunate, but that's also the reality. And I think these things are, again, things we have to watch out for very carefully, both as nation states, but also as institutions who are working in these sectors, as research organizations who are trying to unravel what is going to be the long-term impact on any inequity of this pandemic. It's going to be essential to have a look at that. State capacity, definitely. I think we have seen that it's played out differently in different states, both of their capacity to recover as well as their capacity to handle the pandemic itself. And I think that, the challenges of those have been talked about, but what I think I would also like to talk about is states' capacity to have a gendered response has been lacking in any case across. And I think this probably was the time to say, right, we are talking about a new normal. Can that new normal be a bit more engendered? Can it have a specific gender focus, a more equity focus? Because it's also like, is the access for an upper class women slightly better than an access for a lower class women or an ethnic women? It's also equity. It's not just gender. It's also issues of access because of where you are in that economic trajectory. And I think these things are things that would be more important to look at and study how it has impacted us. I totally take from both what Dr. Niaz and Mohammad Naciri said about the fact that it is probably time for us also to really understand what would moving forward require in terms of both and very, very clear gender lens to recovery, just by reviewing our stimulus package, but also looking at skills and capacities that would be needed, that would come into force, and where are we going to make our investments as institutions and as nation states to ensure that we do not further expand this gap along gender and equity lines. And I think that's where I'd like to stop and maybe open it up to the next speaker to take it from here.
Thank you, Nandita. Yeah. So, Simi.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Thank you for sharing your remarks. I now invite Ms. Irfa Puspitasari to introduce her. She is research staff at the CSGS Universitas Airlangga, Indonesia. She holds a master's degree in international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. And her research areas include migration, gender, development, and international politics. Irfa, over to you.
Thank you for the chance to give opinion on the matter. I'm sorry if there is some noise in the background because I also keep my my son's playing with his mate.
Your voice is inaudible. Your video has just frozen.
She's not muted, no?
No.
Some connection issue.
Some connection issues.
We can go to Govind, ma'am. Simi, I will check.
Okay, all right. So I wanted to really take out the kind of what will be the take home kind of major point that I came up. And one of the things that Mohammad raised a number of points in terms of, but particularly major divisions were in terms of how it has impacted and what needs to be done. Puspa, you want to come in now? I think we can give the way and I can come later. Are you able to?
Hello, can you please?
Yes. Maybe you can turn your video off so that we can have a better bandwidth. You're muted. Please unmute yourself. No, you're not audible.
No, she's muted. It's still muted. It's showing.
Okay, we can. I'll check with Irfa and ma'am, we can continue.
Okay, all right. So Mohammad very well pointed out, in fact, the kind of the overall, he has a very good broad picture. Thank you, Mohammad, so much of the Asia Pacific region, particularly Asia, in terms of talking about the two pandemics, which is really surprising that any disaster is likely to affect the weaker more than probably. So Nandita is right in that sense, then the better off. But in this particular situation, what has been a puzzle to us is really, which Mohammad pointed out, and I agree, totally agree with me, with him, that is how the not only economic insecurity, but insecurity within home has increased. So there was a double kind of insecurity that women and girls were impacted. One was the insecurity that was caused by the pandemic, and the other insecurity was caused by the not only by the increased care work, but being at home and doing all the care work, meeting the daily needs or the caregivers and the food kind of supplies even then those were subjected to violence, which is really needs a lot of attention in terms of when we deal with the violence, because violence is not simply to be neglected as the kind of, it is very much related to building agency and building the transformative change that we are talking about. So that would be an important thing that he pointed out, and I agree with it very much. Both the jobs in the informal sector were also lost. Migrants were affected, and how the migrant women were particularly affected. That is another kind of thing that needs a narration. So women across the kind of class situation were affected. And here we kind of, the gender categories became more important, not believing in the homogeneity of the women, all women are homogeneous, but then these women were also affected. Second is about Mohammad very well, brilliantly pointed out what needs to be done to mitigate the situation. Of course, and that's why I call it the continued pandemic. And we have not started yet really what needs to be done. And that is still reflecting on it. And of course, it will soon start. That is, one is not to repeat the gender stereotypes. I mean, not really think that women are homebound, and this has the gender stereotypes, including in Southeast Asia. That is, the women are doing the double kind of work. I lived 10 years in Asian Institute of Technology, Niaz. And I really widely travel and widely kind of work on the Southeast Asia, and always was amazed to see this kind of thing, the difference between South Asia, coming from India and living in Southeast Asia. And then I looking at kind of thing, large part of Indonesia and large part of Thailand, and the recent history, they were matrilineal societies. And India has been a lot of countries in South Asia, not only India, has been totally patriarchal, and matrilineality was just in the corners that was confined. So there is a legacy of this which needs to be understood. And of course, the economic development is also different. But one is amazed why the violence still happens in Malaysia. Okay, it has happened otherwise also. Violence is a very kind of part that it defeats the agency of women, it defeats the total process of development. So that is one thing that we need to think more about it. Second question was also protection of the sex workers, and that Mohammed started. And this is very much, there is still a bit of debate going on. I have just kind of recently or today itself, the person and woman editor of a newspaper, daily newspaper, very important one, she sided with the sex workers, that how it has been developed because of the kind of misery of the women and all this. And then they put the people, because of these social cultural norms, they thought that she's supporting sex work. So they put kind of a funny video or obscene video about her, and that as a protest, this kind of thing. This is, I call, the masculine attitudes and patriarchy, how it is kind of backlash is there. That would be, and she comes from a kind of better part of the world, a better part of the India. So that would be the, which has been really known for is matrilineality and less patriarchal. So that is important to say that. Second is about the private sector as part of the solution. Yes, the women's movement has criticized the private sector a lot, but I think that state really now works in collusion with the private sector. So the market need to be made responsible for everything what they do or what they don't do. I mean, that has analysis to be seen. And not by saying that the showing them is not going to help. We have to make them responsible because they are really in the party formulating the party policies and implementing the policies through the state. There is a collusion between state and the market. Third is really the supportive infrastructure, including the parental leave. Yes, that is of course needed, but there is a long way. Sometimes we feel very defeated in terms of with the parental leave also, because parental leave also means really leave for the father or the husband. And they need to really, this pandemic has shown that how the care work has been very, very limited in terms of the shared by some urban men. And we need to look at the social norms in particular. What are the social cultural norms which have still the modern, affected the modern and young people in the so-called technology in digital age? That needs important attention. Policy has to pay to the attention of the changing the social political norms. This was the important thing. Thank you, Mohammed, for your brilliant presentation, and Niaz also. Um, Worsening of gender inequality in South Asia and not so in Malaysia. I think I already dealt with Niaz. I am little disagreement with that. There has been worsening of inequality in Malaysia also. That is not really what that's I call it continued kind of continued impact. It is not yet over. That would be the. Of course, we superficially we don't compare. We don't compare only in economic terms, but we compare in terms of the gender relations. And my friends, for example, in kind of in sociology departments of some universities in Malaysia, they say different things. For example, one of the things is parda, the kind parda of women, or the what do you call the scarf, and that has increased. Mother did not wear, but the daughter has to wear it, and she said that way she felt less attacked by men. I was surprised to see, because I always thought Southeast Asia was so the so-called so liberated compared to South Asia. Now these things have come up, and they have to be seen when the dress code is very much part of the women's mobility, and whether women's mobility has been kind of reduced or it has increased. Do they feel freedom? Freedom is the fundamental thing for the development. So that would be one part that we need to address. What is needed, I agree, Niaz, sir, with very much with you. We had to need more invest in women and children. That is children both, I mean boys and girls. And social services stopped in India. Of course, certainly I agree with you in India analysis, not only in terms of the contraceptives, but many other things were stopped kind of thing. They were given food in a very haphazard way, which did not meet the food needs. And that's why the misery of the kind of migrant situation, which became internationally a kind of infamous incident in India, shows only that how haphazard this policy has been. Uh, Nandita has been my colleague in UNIFEM, so and off and on we have met. And of course, I agree with most of part this thing. I also believe women are not homogeneous category, but women are divided into class and caste situations. We have to think of that. But there is certain commonality that also needs to be, that we understand. That commonality can be the gender-based violence. Kind of after 8 or 10 p.m. in city like Delhi, women who have been attacked, these women have not been really necessarily from the lower class and lower caste kind of thing. Any woman is vulnerable. Of course, the caste protects her, or class protects her in terms of being a transport. But if she's walking, she will not be spared. She would be subject to the same kind of thing. So this is the kind of thing, how you are able to protect yourself. And protect against whom? You are protecting against the so-called, quote, civilized people. You are not protecting yourself against the animals. That is the kind of thing. What is this system of protection? This is very much kind of male system that has come to the kind of in open very much. I live in Gurgaon, which is the call center city, or the kind of high-tech city, and there also that this area is not safe, this area is safe. This concept has come. I learned last week that this area is not safe for senior citizens. So I said, why senior citizens? Both men and women are under attack, but women in particular, because young people who are unemployed, they push them and they get some kind of, they would be wearing gold jewelry, some bangles, some kind of chain here and there, and they won't be strong enough to, so these areas have become kind of unsafe areas. So this is the, and people say, oh, the young people, when is unemployed, they are likely to do. And there is a reason for it, how long one can remain hungry. One would kind of get this kind of thing. So there is a need for to look at growing inequalities, which you have everywhere. And somebody has raised a question, which we will give the floor to Mohammed, He says, which is the country that has been least affected or not affected by the COVID? And also is good in terms of the gender equality. I mean, China, India, France. I look at how the violence has increased globally in this period. It is not only one country which is not kind of thing. Mohammed also has given the figures about Southeast Asia. Why this increase in violence during this kind of critical period when the kind of that shows them? Gig economy, I agree totally with you. I don't know whether the gig economy was earlier more flourishing and it is less now. It may be less now because of the certain things, but I find a lot more women getting engaged now in gig works than they earlier. I don't have the exact figures, but I'm still writing something on gig work. Also has not really, neither it has addressed the question of gender division of labor within home, neither it has addressed the question of violence within home and outside. So gig work has gone as an economic venture without really addressing these questions. So that we need some analysis on that. Agreeing with you, I'm just saying that we need analysis of this gig work. I have a little bit problem with regard to participation also with economists, that we think that if women participate in economics or the kind of, participation and productive work, if then their problem is solved. And economists have been talking about the employment and whether employment is falling or not falling. But what about the assets? What about like the women's rights to housing, women's rights to land, women's right to other productive resources? Because unless they have that, they won't be able to control, neither the violence would be controlled, nor would really they will be able to control their earnings. So they need to be enabled in addressing the social norms, and also employment is necessary, but besides employment, asset distribution is also necessary. And I would think that I think there is some more attention is given to now in SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, but we need to work more, including UN women need to work more in terms of the land rights, housing rights, and how the women's agency can increase in its full form. Uh, COVID impact on inequality also has increased. I mean, it was already there. It is not that it is introduced, but it has really, any country, I don't find somebody has raised the question which does not have the inequality not risen, including in China, whose political economy I have been addressing. China was kind of so-called control kind of situation with regard to COVID. But inequality rose like anything in China. It was already there, but it has increased so much. So maybe one thing that I learned from this, we learned from discussing, among other things, one major thing is inequality need to be addressed in when we are addressing the kind of gender responsive package deals need to be addressed, including in infrastructure, and social norms need to be addressed. Social norms have been changed. It is not that they are static. In every country, they have been changing. But I think social norms has to be kind of treated separately than the whole question of identity of Hindus, identity of Muslims, identity of national identities. Besides this, there is a need to address the kind of social and cultural norm, which treats certain women and men as as if they don't deserve development, they don't deserve equality. That has been in the name of the culture and in the name of the social system. That needs very serious effort, even in the kind of paying our attention to gender equality. Thank you very much. This is what I wanted to share. Can we take Pushpana? Irfa?
Yes. Thank you, ma'am. Irfa, if you could, can you hear me, Irfa?
I can hear you.
Yes. Please go ahead. If you could keep your comments brief so that we are able to hear what Mr. Mohammed has to say. Over to you, Irfa.
Yeah. There's similar patterns in Indonesia. More than 90% business were affected in a negative way. Almost 40% business stopped. More than 40% suffered, and only few are better off. And this caused the companies to permanently or temporarily lay off their workers. And there is a unique phenomena happening here, because the most affected in light of are men. So 16.7% of them are men, and 14.2% female worker were laid off. So men are affected in the worse than women. And in terms of health, men in Indonesia are also susceptible affected by COVID, and there are more men died because of COVID than female. So 7 million, like around 7 million workers were laid off, and only few of them got severance pay. And during this stay-at-home work and stay-at-home schooling, actually women are at disadvantage, because even though there is still gender gap in Indonesia, even though more or less we are equal, but in terms of domestic work, even in educational family, there are still this unfairness for distribution of work between husband and wife. So women get stressed more, and moreover, to those who were laid off, and even for domestic worker also get stressed, because if some of family member were laid off, it will the family atmosphere will get murkier, and it's happening in Indonesia, and also it's happening also in Hong Kong, and I believe Malaysia, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, where most of Indonesian migrant workers work there, and it's those back to family. Children are at disadvantage. They are vulnerable for abuse, because the wife, the mother, get more work, so it's get more stress, and then the most vulnerable are children. So there's sadly there are some of occurrence of domestic abuse done by women to their children. That's sad, and I'm glad because Mohammad Naciri spoke about migrant workers. So in this term, I think India, Philippines, Indonesia, Cambodia more or less have Bangladesh, Sri Lanka have Pakistan, I think, have more or less a similar concern. And this in 2020 there is a 40 decrease in migrant worker departure, and that you have mentioned that most of them are informal worker, and also during this pandemic, migration policy became more strict. For example, there are deportations everywhere in Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, and I think borrowing from Giorgio Agamben, this COVID-19 is used to construct the state of exception. By this way, state as the ally decide whether to accept, deport, or refuse migrants and refugees. So, for example, Rohingya refugees, and they also at disadvantage in the health matter, and because, for example, domestic worker, they are the one who need to go to buy, to shop for the families. They need to do all of those things, and so they still need to go in public area during the pandemic between March and June 2020. So they are more vulnerable than any other member for being infected by COVID. However, actually, I have still some optimistic in this matter, because first, we have. I'm glad that we love woman leader, for example, Susi Pujiastuti Mulyani, Risma, the city major of Surabaya. They are doing their best. We admire them. They are doing a very good measure, because it is Risma who is the first leader in Indonesia in as a city majors, who give a policy to give a free healthcare for those affected with COVID. And I'm glad to observe that people are giving even in these difficult situations. If even army students, everyone in a small villages, they are giving each other. So
right,
I'm glad to say that. Yeah.
Right,
So
Irfa,
I'm glad to say that
just
we
wind
have.
up.
Okay. So my conclusion is that I'm glad to say that I still observe some social capital, but the social capital in here is tested because of social distancing. And I think government is doing their best under the circumstance, for example, through green recovery, and also they show their concern on migrant workers, and migrant workers is matter for the government. So I think that's my conclusion at the moment.
Thank you, Irfa, for providing the Indonesian perspective. That was very enlightening. Now we go to Mr. Mohammed for your responses, and there are a number of questions. Maybe if you had the time to look through them, but please respond as much as you can and as much as your time permits, so that we can wind up in the next few minutes. Over to you, Mr. Mohammed.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta, and I think we agreed that you can call me Mohammed. I'm very grateful to the discussants and to the commentary from you, Professor Kelkar. I also have to note and to pay tribute to your good self and to Ms. Baruah, because if it wasn't for you and all those who have worked with and for the cause under the umbrella of UNIFEM, we would not have been here today as UN Women. So we're very grateful to you. I would start first with your last comment, Professor Kelkar, that UN Women needs to do more. Absolutely. The agenda is exhaustive. The issues are evolving every day. And we really need to continue to make sure that we are relevant and of meaning to the women and girls in the Asia-Pacific region. It would also be very naive of me to assume that we can do it on our own, because we really need all hands on deck. We need the experts like your good self. We need all other agencies, the government, the private sector, as you rightly mentioned, and also the civil society. Another reflection on the sex work and the sex workers: we're not here for the promotion of sex work, but we're definitely here for the protection of sex workers. And we need to continue to see how these groups of people, whether men or women or other genders, are amongst the most vulnerable in every society, and they are even hit even more in times of pandemics and disasters. I would also like to reflect on what Ms. Baruah has said, that the world is governed by patriarchy. Absolutely. And I am grateful that you did use the term patriarchy and not masculinity only, because patriarchy is not only in the minds of men and boys. Unfortunately, it is still in the minds and makeup of many women, girls, and other genders. When we were rolling out the work on masculinities in the Arab states, it is called the Arab states in UN Women. I prefer Middle East and North Africa. It's less nationalistic. When we did focus group discussions with women and we asked them, what does a man mean? Answers came along the lines, if my husband doesn't beat me, he doesn't love me. If my father doesn't send my younger brother with me to the mall, he doesn't care about me. Or if my brother doesn't prevent me from going out of the house, he's a sissy, he's not a man. So there is a lot, and there's a long way that we need to go to change the mindset of the communities and societies. And as you rightly said, Professor Kelkar, this will not happen without norm change. And norm change is not going to be tackled unless we work on education, unless we work on and with media institutions, unless we work with the folkloric narrative, stopping the Cinderellas and the Snow Whites of the world, and coming up with different folkloric narratives that are built on equality. And finally, the big elephant in the room, the religious discourse. So these are not going to, these are major elements for the norm change. Dr. Asadullah, I would also think a bit deeper about the differentiations, because if we look into the region that we're talking about, I think these are 4 regions in one. We're talking about South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. And I do find it a bit problematic to compare a country like Singapore or to Brunei with a country of the population of India. I would find it a bit problematic to compare Malaysia with a country like Bangladesh that does not only have more population, but also has been hit with a natural disaster that happens only once in a generation's time during COVID. In addition, they are dealing with a humanitarian crisis, with all the international development work has been diverted to serve the Rohingya. So as if Bangladesh has been freed from all its developmental challenges and all the work has been going to the Rohingya. I would find it a bit tricky to compare a country under sanctions like Iran with a country like Indonesia. So I think what we need to look into is comparators that are beyond the geographic and differentiation and the governance systems that you have referred to, because the governance systems are only one amongst many other comparators. I stop here, Dr. Mehta. I know that we were hoping naively that we would have 2 rounds of discussions, but the first round was very rich, thought-provoking, and I really appreciated how all of us were not necessarily inhibited by things that would have limited our interventions. I think we can stay here until tomorrow, but maybe this is only the first opportunity for me to interact with all of you, and I really, really hope that I would have the chance to interact with you again. Back to you, Dr. Mehta.
Thank you, Mohammad. It was really humbling. Thank you so much. We reciprocate the same. So yes, because of the paucity of time, it would not be great to extend it further. Although we would love to hear more of the participants and the discussants' views. So Professor Kelkar, if you could just close the session and we could end it through vote of thanks. Professor Kelkar. Ma'am, you're muted.
Said only one sentence I would like to say, that one thing that I was very impressed, that we are used to talking freely coming from a university, civil society, But Mohammed, you also talked like a civil society person. You were very free, and we really appreciate. And this is the strength of this was the strength of UNIFEM, and this is the strength of UN Women. So I mean, once you are in these forums, then of course that whole UN aura you forget, and you relate to us. Thank you very much, and thank you so much others for being free and giving really talking about various differences and very freely, and Niaz in particular. That I agree with you in terms of these differences, because I was 10 years in the Asian Institute of Technology teaching, and repeatedly I could see the difference between South and Southeast Asia. So I do agree on major part. Thank you. And Nandita is not there, or?
Ma'am is here. Ma'am is here.
Okay. So of course, Nandita, Baruah, and we have kind of in agreement, and on the major parts have been like this and debating these issues. And where is Puspa? Irfa?
Her device is
Hello.
presenting some challenges.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Talking of the
I'm
Indonesia.
here.
Yes, that's right. We had the pleasure of visiting Indonesia so many times, and even doing some work. So that has been really, it reminds such kind of those days when looking at that and learning to that society and the challenges of both South and Southeast Asia is a pleasure. Thank you very much. So over to both of you.
Dr. Niaz, you had raised your hand. If we could just have 1 minute to both Niaz and Nandita, ma'am.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think having a follow-up session would be wonderful, because what this session has done is to sort of, identify a couple of fault lines which merits further discussion, particularly what Mohammed picked up on, that the choice of comparator and whether there is any value in sort of comparing countries and learning from each other. The reason why I was drawing the comparison is not kind of reflecting on the management of the pandemic per se, but what has been the evolution of policy towards women within the region. I have been studying textbook, for instance, textbook content, school children's textbook content, comparing Indonesia, Malaysia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And I would really love to come back and share with you, because if you are really looking for the smoking gun, that, well, if you're trying to trace the root cause of why societies treat men and women differently, there is a policy entry point, and that is the textbook. So if you're trying to tackle patriarchy, I mean, you don't have to deal with the religious clerics all the time. There are other ways to sort of, penetrate and change mindsets. Because again, I've been, studying how South Asian women perceive and respond to domestic violence. And again, I'll be happy to share my research with you that they are being socialized to accept violence. Exactly the point that Mohammed mentions with reference to Arab countries. But for South Asia, it is striking that when you ask women about acceptance of domestic violence, they will give you the socially compliant answer. But when you find a way to give them the confidence that they are not being identified while they are giving you the response, they reveal their true hidden support for violence. And that takes me to Southeast Asia, where Professor Kelkar was referring to that, well, it's not that there is no violence, but the point is that the violence manifests very differently towards women in Southeast Asia compared to South Asia. There hasn't been any rape epidemic during pandemic in Southeast Asia. So there has been cases of domestic violence. There have been many thousands of phone calls being made by distressed women, but we haven't experienced gang rapes at a scale that we have seen in other parts. And that brings me back to my reference to baseline empowerment. What has happened in Southeast Asia is that 3 decades before South Asia, gender gap in schooling access has been closed 3 decades back. And that has therefore created an across the board acceptance that access to social opportunity are equal, and women have entered labor market based on equal human capital and capability. And that therefore translated in the difference that we see at the regional level. So again, this is not a culturally driven explanation. This is rooted in policy, and that's where I felt that maybe there is a room for exchange of ideas. Again, that I think is a separate session, but I'm more than happy to come back and again, participate in similar discussion with colleague from Asia Foundation and UN Women, and of course IMPRI. Now, last response to Nandita, again, the state capacity I should have added. When I was referring to state capacity, it is co-opting women in strengthening state capacity, because if we go by the evidence during COVID, it turns out that female leaders did well compared to male leaders. And again, if you look at Kerala, it had female health minister. And again, at the national level, there are studies highlighting that lives and livelihood have received better protection in countries where there was higher presence of women in leadership. So that again brings up the point where state capacity and female leadership can combine to address your concern that, well, it has to be a gendered response. So I think I'll stop here. Again, thank you so much to all of you. I'll be delighted to come back, and anything I said is based on my research in Malaysia and Bangladesh. Again, I'll be more than happy.
Thank you, Dr. Niaz. Thank you. Nandita ma'am, if quickly you can just come in.
Comments. One, I think state capacities are also to be looked at differentially. There is a state capacity in India at the national and the subnational and the rural level. We find a very, very empowered rural panchayat system in India on which the women's movement has invested years and years of time, with more than 50% women today there. And I think therefore, probably some of the impact was mitigated better in rural India than in urban India. Secondly, violence is not linear. I think we need to remember, just like women aren't, there is no one form of violence. I was studying Korea and I looked at, as the most developed society, the level of violence that women face in Korea, probably not the same as in India, but in terms of having cameras put, sexual abuse, sexual molestation, and online harassing. The story can go on, and those are forms of violence. So I think it's important for us to recognize when we say that there is a difference in violence, we also need to look at that, in different society, violence gets exhibited differently. In Cambodia, where I worked for 4.5 years, it was interesting. Again, I also went with the belief that it's better off than South Asia in terms of violence, but the level of leeway and the openness that's given to men to have relationships outside their marriage and it becomes an acceptable norm, to me, is also a manifestation of violence. And that's a widely accepted practice across class. I remember a colleague of mine once said her husband said to her, "Why can't you be like other wives when I go out on the weekend? Why can't you just trust a condom in my hand and tell me to be safe rather than tell me not to go?" Because that's the accepted norm. And that is visible from all the kind of various bar gardens, clubs, etc., and the way sexuality is being sold in Southeast Asian countries. So violence can be covert, overt, inherent, and played out differently. So I think we need to be cognizant. There are forms and forms of violence, and each of them require a different response. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was really very powerful. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful having all of you and participate in this discussion. And certainly Mohammad's and Dr. Niaz's suggestion of having a follow-up session is well taken, and we'll definitely do it in the times to come. And thank you. Officially, I now propose the vote of thanks. On behalf of Gender Impact Studies Center at Impact and Policy Research Institute. We have had actually over 50 webinars during the pandemic under the leadership of Professor Govind Kelkar. And we have had top experts joining us and different stakeholders to discuss the state of gender equality and #gender gaps at IMPRI. So thank you so much, Mohammad Naciri, for joining us and for delivering this distinguished lecture. It was really wonderful listening to you. And Professor Niaz, your comments and your discussion really illuminated us. Ms. Nandita, thank you for sharing your comments. Very, very insightful. And Irfa, thank you so much for providing your perspectives from Indonesia. It was really a very enriching session. And thank you very much, Professor Kelkar and Team IMPRI. Thank you so much. I wish you all a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, IMPRI. Thank you,
Bye.
Govind. Thank you. Bye. See you.
Such a frank learning session. Thank you, everybody. Such a frank and learning session.